Well, thank you everyone for taking 30 minutes out of the busy CERAWeek schedule to come hear about deploying DAC from the perspective of both a technology developer and a project developer. So I want to start off with what I thought of DAC in 2019, which is I didn't think it really made any sense. I couldn't get over the fact that we were emitting pure CO2, not capturing it, and then proposing to pull it out of the air somewhere else. That didn't make sense. It seemed too expensive, right? $500 a ton, $700 a ton. And I didn't think anyone would pay for it. So I think I did not see DAC coming, and now it's a lot of what I and 8 Rivers works on every day. The reason I changed my mind, 3 key features that DAC, direct air capture, can provide that are unique. One of which is that for hard-to-abate sectors, the cost of removing CO2 or mitigating CO2 can be extremely high, anywhere from $200 to $1,000 a ton. DAC creates a price ceiling. Whatever cost we get DAC to, say it's $300 a ton, you should never pay more to abate emissions than that, right? That's the price ceiling for carbon mitigation around the world. Secondly, is I got a lot more optimistic about cost declines. This is a chart from the battery sector. May we be so lucky to see such a steep cost decline, but we really do think that DAC can get to that sub 200 and maybe sub $100 a ton level that makes it really play a big role in decarbonization. And the third thing, which is unique to DAC, is that DAC gives us a reverse clutch. Let's say it's 2040. Hopefully we all did our jobs, the energy transition happened on time, and we're sitting at a ppm where the temperature is where we like it. But it's certainly possible that we fail, right? The energy transition, as you all know, is extremely difficult. Decades and decades of success. It's nice to have the option to go in reverse. I don't recommend it. It would be far more expensive than reducing emissions. Mitigation is definitely the best path here. But for humanity, having that tool where we can reverse DAC, reverse the ppm, is something we should have in our civilizational toolkit. So I work on this at 8 Rivers. If you haven't heard of us, 8 Rivers invents and commercializes climate tech, primarily carbon capture. We're best known for our technology in the clean power space with the Alum cycle, clean hydrogen with 8RH2. Our business model, we both invent technologies as we hold the patents. We then develop the projects using those technologies. So today I'm going to tell you about our DAC technology called Calcite. We announced it in, I think, 2022. It left stealth mode when we won the Carbon Removal X Prize, but we've been working on it since back in 2019. So we like to think of Calcite as the dumbest, simplest, easiest way to do mechanical direct air capture. So the chart you're seeing on the screen here, this is the calcium cycle. This is how the Earth actually manages CO2 over millennia, is by locking it up in calcium. It's how the Romans built their buildings. This is about the oldest chemistry that humans know. We start off in the top left corner here with a kiln. So we're heating up limestone to about 900, 950 degrees Celsius when the CO2 pops off and we capture it. So we do that with oxy-fired calcination, so we do it in a high oxygen environment. That generates calcium oxide, which we hydrate into calcium hydroxide. This is the main material in mortar. If you guys are putting pictures on your wall with mortar, this is how it sticks. We use this mortar-like substance to absorb CO2 in an air contactor. So we're passing huge amounts of air over this sorbent in a unique manner that allows it to absorb CO2 quickly and at low cost. That is the air contactor that looks like DAC, right? That's your long, kilometers of fans, right, pulling air across the sorbent. That calcium hydroxide becomes calcium carbonate. So that's CaCO3. The CO2 is now locked up in stone. That calcium carbonate is chemically the same thing as limestone. So we can put it back in the kiln, heat it back up to 950 degrees Celsius. The CO2 comes off. This time that CO2 is from the air. We store it in a Class 6 well and repeat the process. So this is a really simple approach to DAC. It is not the fanciest chemistry. We really like it because it uses really well-known equipment. There's really good suppliers for everything having to do with limestone, calcium oxide, calcium hydroxide, so we don't have to build a new supply chain. When you go back and look at solar and what the winning solar technology was, it wasn't the best material. Like perovskites are definitely a better material for solar than silicon, but silicon was really well understood and they could reach low cost quickly. So we think this is an approach that has really high promise to reaching low cost quickly, allowing it to play a big role in the next 20 to 25 years of decarbonization that we're all staring down. So if we look broader than just Calcite, we think we're seeing 2 different kinds of DAC deployments out in the market right now. One is modularized, and one is stick-built. So if you think of a modularized house, right, you've got a container, and then you basically assemble it on site with very little work, as opposed to a stick-built house. In the energy sector, solar panels are modular, right? That's the modular approach. Combined cycle plants, those are basically built on site. A lot of DAC technologies are low temperature, so they're regenerating their sorbent at maybe 120 degrees Celsius with steam. Most of those end up as modular, right? Those you can really package into a nice module, print them out in a factory, send them to the site. Whereas more of the high temperature DAC, so we're using our sorbent at 900 degrees Celsius, that's pretty hot. We aren't well suited for modulars. We have giant kilns. And so we end up with more of a stick-built approach. When you look at different DAC technologies, you can pretty quickly notice which ones are taking the modular approach versus which ones are planning to build their equipment and assemble it primarily on the site. That's one of the key things we focus on. We probably focus even more on the revenue. If we want to build hundreds of millions of tons of DAC, someone has to pay for it. You're going to need bank debt. And so it really comes down to who's actually buying this stuff? Like what companies are actually going to pay for you to remove CO2 from the air and functionally give them a certificate? So for our DAC plants right now, there are two primary sources of revenue. The first source are the offtakes, so that we functionally sell a credit, right, where we've removed CO2 on behalf of someone else. To build these plants, we're not going to be able to sell these direct to consumers. We need something financeable. So we need a big company who has got a high credit rating who can sign up right now to buy DAC for the next 10 years. That long-term contract is what we can turn into the construction equity and debt we need to build the plant. If you look at who's buying DAC already, we're seeing airlines, tech companies, and financial institutions as really the three types of organizations who are currently looking to buy DAC. We think that trend probably continues. To be a good customer for DAC, your product needs to be really valuable, right? You need to actually be able to sustain the cost of DAC, which is one of the more expensive ways to reduce CO2. You need to not have any better options, right? If you can install solar panels, install solar panels. If you can do post-combustion capture, DAC is more of a last resort, right? And you need to really be focused on carbon mitigation and how you can help in the long term. So the tech companies, they're often doing this because they want to get us down the cost curve. It's because they care about hitting the 2040 or 2050 targets. You need an early buyer to scale the industry. But the thing we can pair those carbon offtakes with is 45Q. As you've probably heard ad nauseum this entire conference, Congress passed a bill about in August last year increasing subsidies for everybody. Every technology gets a subsidy, and direct air capture is no different. It's called 45Q, and it's a tax credit for $180 per ton of every molecule of CO2 you pull from the air and sequester in a Class 6 well. So the first thing to note is that we can have our cake and eat our cake. You are allowed to both claim tax credits and claim environmental attributes. The solar and wind industry has been doing it for the last 30 years with RECs and the PTC. The government is not asking you for the attributes, right? What they're doing is they're making it cheaper for companies to buy the attributes. So if you had a DAC plant that was $300 a ton, instead of selling it for $300 a ton to, a tech company, they might not buy it, you can actually buy down that cost with the 45Q credit. There's a bunch of quirks that come with the credit. It's not cash. Cash would be better. The first 5 years of the credit, you get a cash refund from the IRS. In years 6 to 12, it's a tax credit. You have to go find Bank of America, Credit Suisse, Goldman Sachs. You have to find some party who pays enough taxes that they can take this credit and turn it into cash for you. That's not ideal. It's going to be one of the big challenges across US deployments of clean energy is can we really scale up tax credit monetization and tax equity to meet the number of deployments we're going to need here. It's also time limited. You get it for 12 years. So one question we have is, what does the DAC plant do in year 13 to 20, right? And how the pricing changes for selling DAC for that period of time. And also you have to start construction of the plant in 2032. Otherwise you can't claim the credit. If you do the math though, that actually takes us a long way down the journey. If I started construction on a plant in 2032, I complete it in 2035, that's when my 12-year clock starts. So you're going to see, under the current legislation, you're going to see DAC plants getting 45Q credits up until about 2047. So this really is a long-range credit. It's part of what makes it so attractive is we can really plan out the business for the next 20 years, knowing that there's a revenue source here. The goal, of course, is to get the cost down with this credit. So we need this high credit now because DAC is still quite expensive, but in doing these deployments, that's what gets us the cost down so that first, the offtakes get cheap enough that people will buy them at scale, and then secondly, so we don't need such a large credit in order to deploy DAC out in the world. The LCFS, the reason I have this question in here, is you can claim the LCFS and 45Q, but you can't claim the LCFS and offtakes. So this is low carbon fuel standards are set up by states, primarily California. They're buying your credits and retiring them. So you can pair 45Q with anything else, pretty much nothing else for revenue source pairs. And really the unique thing is that's the revenue stream. Like we're not selling power, we're not selling hydrogen, so there's really a pretty simple financial model if you can get these two numbers to work. So as developers, we're thinking pretty hard about where should the DAC plants go. The DAC plants pretty much don't exist yet, so we all have a blank sheet to think about where this industry is going to be, and we want to run through a couple factors that are shaping our and other companies' thinking. First of all, this is the United States of America. It is the best place to build DAC by a long shot. And even before 45Q, it had a lot of advantages. We really think you're going to see the industry scaling here. One reason is land. Doesn't matter how you build your DAC plant, it's going to use a lot of land. Not so much for the fans, right? Not so much to pass the air. It's actually the spacing in between them. So if you're pulling air in and exhausting it at say 100 ppm, that air needs to disperse. You don't want to have two DAC plants next to each other where one of them is exhausting 100 ppm and the one right next to it is taking in 100 ppm. So you're going to have actually most of your land use is spacing. And this is like the wind industry, right? You look at wind farms, they use a ton of land, but they're not using most of it, right? Most of it is still growing corn in Iowa, but they've got the wind farms in the middle. DAC will look somewhat like that. And so you need to find locations where you have thousands of acres available to really build out a DAC ecosystem. The second is weather. DAC systems are pretty sensitive. We can't condition the air coming into them. There's just too much air. So you have to pick a location where it likes the weather all year round. For calcite, it likes it warm and it likes it humid. So the Southeast has warmth and humidity in spades, and so you're going to see a lot of our deployments in the southern and particularly southeast part of the country. Other DAC technologies are different. Some DAC technologies don't like having water in the air and actually have to remove it, so they're going to be looking for dry air. So it's really a driver for DAC deployments, probably more than any other kind of energy technology. To run DAC, we need natural gas for our kiln, and we need power. You got to run DAC on clean energy. If you're pulling CO2 from the air while emitting it from your power plant, that's an inefficient way to run a system. So you're really going to site these plants where you have access to clean power and where you can source your natural gas in places that have really low methane leakage, or preferably where you can pair in with RNG to get to really low upstream. So you're not kind of doing that Sisyphean struggle of emitting CO2 on one side, sucking it back up for a higher cost, a couple meters down the road. CO2 storage, the US has the best CO2 storage in the world. It's the most developed, it's the most well understood. We've got pipelines, we've got class 6 wells. For us, we're in the Southeast. There's CO2 pipelines that already exist going from Houston to Louisiana to Mississippi. You also have lots of existing CO2 pipelines going north to south from Montana down to New Mexico. For early DAC deployments, we think they're going to be clustered around existing storage. It's too risky to do DAC on its own. You can't pair it with the risk of some unknown subsurface reservoir that hasn't really been proven out. Ambient CO2 has a question mark on it. There is not good data on what the CO2 concentration is at ground level. We all know it's 412 ppm high atmosphere. That's not where it is right in this room. In this room, it's certainly exceeded 1,000 ppm at this point. And at different sites, you're going to see it range from 200 ppm probably up to 1,000. So a lot of DAC siting is going to be finding sites where the CO2 ppm is higher, so you have less work to do. And understanding that variability. Cornfields in the middle of the growing season are going to suck the CO2 down a lot. So you're going to have variability diurnally and seasonally as well that you have to control for. And the last one here is environmental justice, and it should not be last because this is going to be critical to DAC. We're building a new industry. We have a chance to do this one right. The whole idea of DAC is remediating CO2 we'd already emitted. Like, it's supposed to be an idea of causing positive things, not causing harm. We have great siting flexibility. We're not selling power. We don't have to be at a substation. We don't have to be near population centers. We should put DAC in communities where they want them to be, where those communities get those benefits, where we're remediating past environmental harms and not causing more ones. I think we're pretty excited about this. DAC can bring a lot of economic benefits and shouldn't be bringing air pollution harms. But it's something we really have to focus on from day zero out to 2050 and having DAC be something that benefits the communities. Otherwise, we're not going to get enough of them built. Right? We all talk about permitting, right? And a lot of that comes down to, do the people where you're building it, do they want the facility there? Do they want to be living next to it for the next couple decades? I think something else from a business model perspective on DAC, we don't, at least for us, for the high temperature DAC, we don't think it's going to be spread out. You look at, gas power plants and solar plants, those are spread across the country because the demand is spread across the country. Lucky for us, CO2 is still fairly well mixed. We could build an entire DAC business with 2 sites and just have these basically mega DAC cities where we put all of our deployments. That looks more like an LNG business model, right? Where like Cheniere, you have 1 or 2 mega sites that you build out. You don't need to spread those sites out across every state in America. So that is how we are thinking about DAC and what we're seeing in the DAC industry. Calcite itself is focusing on getting its pilot online. In the next year or so, we've announced offtakes for that from Frontier, which is a group of Stripe, Google, Meta. From there, we'll be going up to a 50,000 ton a year plant. And from there, we're going to be building as many of these plants as fast as we can. We think DAC is in a really exciting spot, and we think the 2020s are going to be the golden age of DAC. We don't just see one winner here. With 45Q, there's going to be lots of technologies that get up to scale in the 2020s, and then there's going to be brutal competition to see who's actually the lowest cost. Right, so that's where we are. I think right now it's happy days. Everyone is out building their DAC as fast as they can, and kind of we'll see how useful of a tool can we make this in the decarbonization toolkit. It's not going to be the main tool, right? Emissions reductions are what we need to be doing now, but we think DAC can play a critical role, and we're excited for Calcite to be one of the major DAC technologies scaling over the next couple decades. So I think I've managed to do this talk short enough to take questions, so really appreciate everyone's attention here, and looking forward to any questions you have on DAC, 8 Rivers, and Calcite.
Yep, you're right on time, so we have time for plenty of questions, about 10 minutes here, so anyone want to ask Adam a question? Yep. And state your name and the company you're with.
I'm Bruce Raw from Green Cape. Interested to understand how much power this would use per ton of carbon.
So I can give you general numbers at larger scale. So if you're building 1 million tons a year of net DAC, power demand looks around like 40 to 60 megawatts in that range is where it's going to sit. It's pretty similar across technologies for the compression side, so CO2 compression, and the airflow side. We have pretty low pressure drop, so our main pressure drop is coming from louvres outside of the plant. But you'll see ranges there where if someone's using electric power for desorption, it could get a lot higher than that. But for us, it's in that 50-ish megawatt range per million ton per year capacity. I'll let you do the division in terms of the megawatts per ton.
Hi, Kevin Bonebrake from Quays Energy. Just a point of clarification there, is that thermal or electric you're talking about in terms of your process? You're talking about a kiln. So.
That was electrical energy.
Okay.
Thermal energy, I think calcination is something like 5 gigajoules per ton of calcium oxide, somewhere around there. So that's our major energy demand is thermal, right? So we've got natural gas going into the kiln, but we're able to capture all the CO2 from that gas. So we have 0 emissions thermal energy because of the carbon capture.
Any other questions? Well, okay.
Hi, I'm Ian Tobin from Carbon Clean. So I think if I caught it right at the beginning, you mentioned you think you can get the cost per ton down to $100 per ton?
That is everyone's cost target.
Okay, but what would be the main drivers from a substantial starting point versus that point?
Yeah. So every DAC technology is going to say we want to get to sub $100 a ton. The reason we all say that is when you look at the math of where is that price ceiling where we're going to get massive deployment, that's $100 a ton. To get there, you need a couple things. One of which is you need a really low cost of capital. Right? Building a DAC plant has to look like building a solar plant, where you have low cost of equity and debt. Secondly is you need really cheap energy. If gas is expensive and if power is expensive, you can never get below that. And so that really is locating the DAC plant where you have pretty much stranded energy is how you're going to get there. And then the third thing is CapEx declines and performance increase. So for us, that means how low can we get the cost of the fans, of the buildings, of the kiln, and kind of traveling down that cost curve. There's a big question of, does DAC look like solar, right? Like what does that cost curve look like? It's different across technologies. And then you have performance increase. For us, it's, how fast can we react with CO2? How quickly to form calcium carbonate? Across different technologies, the details will be different. They're going to have a different sorbent. They might work with potassium or they might work with amines, but you're going to have sorbent stability, sorbent reactivity, and getting those things as high as possible is how you get there. That to me, that is an end state, right? That is not plant 5, right? That is, if you do this right, in 2040, when you're at full maturity, your lowest possible cost, that's when you can get below that $100 a ton number.
Any other questions from the audience?
Sorry, this is Dan Steinberg from the National Renewable Energy Lab. Do you know like the two-dimensional land area that's impacted by the decrease in the CO2 concentration?
The two-dimensional land area.
Like what area are you impacting? You're talking about siting constraints with respect to parking DAC facilities next to each other. So like what's the
I will give
size?
envelope math.
Yeah.
But if you had a 1 million ton a year DAC plant, it's somewhere around 200, 300 to 300 acres. So compared to trees, it's extremely space efficient, right? Like it's small from that sense. If you do the math on if we wanted to do a gigaton, it's a pretty small in the span of the United States landmass area, and maybe around 2/3 of that is spacing, which is kind of the land between the air contactors, but that's going to vary by technology and also like a CFD analysis of how fast can you get the air to disperse so you can put these things closer together.
Okay, any other questions from the audience? So I was going to ask you one here in a second. Okay, so CERAWeek is obviously a global conference. We have people in the audience from Korea, Canada. I've seen different countries. Europe is a region. How does the cost curve kind of compare for the United States now with 45Q and IRA versus other regions, and kind of are customers from outside of the U.S. coming to you all for your advice and technology?
Yeah, I think the DAC land rush is definitely in the U.S. I don't know of anywhere that can compete with the $108 a ton subsidy. I think we will see that over time. I think you're seeing kind of a great power competition and who can incentivize these clean energy technologies of the future. Right now, we see the U.S. in the lead. That said, DAC has a bunch of peculiar characteristics, right? You're going to see DAC plants in Iceland because there's free kind of sulfur-smelling heat there from their geothermal vents. So I think different countries might have stranded fuels that you can't export. DAC becomes a demand source for, say, stranded natural gas. Or you're going to have particular weather conditions that are really suitable, or maybe waste minerals. So we do think you'll see global DAC because each DAC technology is going to need a different mix of things. But I think you're also going to see concentration. DAC isn't going to be in every country. It doesn't need to be. The CO2 emissions are in every country. They mix. There's going to be a couple places where it makes the most sense to do DAC. And I think there you're going to see a lot of the DAC deployments. The asterisk I would put on that is I'm talking like a high temperature person. We're stick building, right? If you're modular, you might say the opposite. You might say, I need waste heat. Waste heat is everywhere, and so I'm going to go put my modules, where district heating is. But for us, it's very much going to be concentrated.
All right, any other questions for Adam before we close the session out? Oh, there's one.
I haven't heard you talk about the Class 6 well or the pipeline system for the CO2 at the end of the day. How much of that is a constraint or a percentage of the cost that you're looking at to be sited, nearby where a system will be, like one of these hubs that are being created in the U.S. versus out in Florida or whatever?
It's a great question on CO2 pipelines and Class 6 wells. It's a small part of the cost. I mean, people will talk about CO2 transport and storage anywhere from $7 a ton to $25 a ton. It's a small part of your cost of the DAC unit. I would say an interesting piece is insurance. If you're paying someone to store CO2 for $10 a ton, but it's worth $200 a ton to you, like there's a difference in liability there that's going to be hard to deal with. Right now, Class 6 wells and pipelines are ahead of DAC. Right, DAC, no one has built any big DAC plants. So right now, we can just site these where there's already mature CO2 pipelines and storage. Come 2030, has CO2 TNS scaled enough for tens of millions and tons of years of DAC? I think it will. I think CO2 TNS is a harder solution for like power plants and industrial plants where they have to be a particular place. We can site it where the storage is, assuming it's warm and humid and maybe has some limestone. Well, look, thank you everyone for taking the time out to listen. I'll be here after to take any other questions. 8 Rivers also has a booth down by the Clean Energy Commons. So happy to talk about Calcite or any of our clean energy technologies, and appreciate the attention.